Hello, and welcome back. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere far from here, onto a train, cutting through snow and silence, somewhere in the heart of the Alps, in the winter of 1935. This is the story of a night on the Orient Express. A locked door, a man who did not survive till morning, and not a single mark upon his body to explain why. Every passenger aboard swears they heard nothing, saw nothing, and each of them, when questioned, offers an alibi so clean, so complete, that it almost seems rehearsed. Travelling under a name that is not his own is a small, tired Belgian gentleman with an extraordinary mind, a man who has, more than once, listened not to what people say, but to what they are so very careful not to say, because sometimes the loudest thing in a room is the silence. So settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let's step aboard. This is the Silent Carriage. If you enjoy stories like this, you're welcome to stay a while longer. There's more waiting for you. The beginning of the journey. My feet ached before the train had even left the station, which I took, at the time, to be a small and personal injustice, and nothing more. I did not yet know it was an omen. I am not accustomed to travelling under a false name. It sits upon me the way a borrowed coat sits upon a man of different proportions. The sleeves a little long, the collar a little tight, and always, always, the fear that a gust of wind will show the lining beneath. But my good friend at the Sûreté had been most insistent. "Poirot," he had said, over a telephone line thick with static, "there are men aboard that train who would very much like to know your whereabouts, and would like it even more if your whereabouts were permanent." And so I became, for the duration of this journey from Istanbul to Calais, one Monsieur Achille Reynaud, a retired wine merchant of Lyon, travelling for his health and for no other reason whatsoever. It is a testament to something, vanity perhaps, or simple fatigue, that I found myself almost enjoying the disguise, at least for the first hour. The Orient Express in December is a different creature from the Orient Express in June. In summer she is gay, restless, full of the chatter of tourists, comparing itineraries. In winter she is quieter, more inward, as though the cold outside has crept in through the very rivets of her carriages and settled into the upholstery. The passengers who choose December are, as a rule, travelling for reasons of necessity rather than pleasure, and necessity makes for interesting company, if not always cheerful. I settled into my compartment, a modest one, befitting a retired wine merchant of modest means, and permitted myself a moment's satisfaction at the little green reading lamp, the neatly folded blanket, the promise of dinner in an hour's time. My valise I placed beneath the seat. My moustaches I examined in the small mirror above the basin, and found them, as always, entirely satisfactory. It is one of the few certainties left to a man in a world so full of murder and inconvenience. It was in the dining car that I first observed my fellow travellers, and I confess that fatigue— I had slept badly the night before, a fact I mention now only because it becomes relevant later, though I did not think so at the time— made my usual powers of observation somewhat less sharp than I should have liked. There was, at the table nearest the door, an English clergyman of perhaps 60 years, Reverend Aldous Whitfield, who ordered his soup and then did not touch it, occupying himself instead with a small leather notebook into which he wrote with the concentration of a man composing either a sermon or a confession. Beside him sat his niece, a young woman called Miss Iris Whitfield, whose gloves never left her hands even at table, and who smiled at everyone with the particular brightness of a person determined not to be asked how she was really feeling. Across the aisle, a Hungarian countess, though I use the title loosely, for these things are so often exaggerated in the retelling, travelled with a small dog and a large quantity of luggage, and complained, charmingly, about the draught from the window, though I could detect no draught at all. There was a Swiss businessman named Herr Lang, precise in his movements, who consulted his pocket watch no fewer than 4 times during the soup course alone, a habit I noted and then, foolishly, dismissed as mere Swiss punctuality. And there was the quiet man. I do not know, even now, quite how to describe what drew my eye to him, except to say that a man who wishes not to be noticed announces himself to a trained eye more loudly than a man who does not care one way or the other. He sat alone at the smallest table, ate sparingly, and spoke to no one. When the conductor passed and greeted him by name, Monsieur Dubois, he inclined his head with the smallest possible movement, as though even this cost him something. He wore his coat indoors, which I attributed at the time to the cold, though I ought to have known better. The dining car was, if anything, overheated. I did not speak to him that first evening. This, I confess, was an error, though whether it changed anything in the end, I still cannot say with certainty. A detective is not infallible, whatever the newspapers may print. He is only a man who notices slightly more than his neighbour, and forgets slightly less. After dinner, I took a short turn through the corridor before retiring, partly for the digestion and partly from that old habit of mine, the habit of counting doors, faces and small details, the way another man might count sheep. It was in this manner that I passed the compartment of Monsieur Dubois, and heard, through the thin wall, two voices where I had expected one. I did not linger. It is not the business of a retired wine merchant to linger outside other men's doors. But I noted it, filed it away, as one files away a receipt one suspects will later be needed, and continued to my own compartment, where I removed my shoes with the great relief of a man whose feet have been complaining for several hours, and permitted myself, at last, to sleep. The train, at that hour, was still running smoothly through the lower valleys, the mountains not yet risen around us like walls of a cell. I did not know, as I closed my eyes, that within it, in one small compartment near the end of the carriage, something had already been set irreversibly in motion, that a man was, at that very moment, either deciding to die or being decided upon. I slept, badly, as I have said, though better than I would sleep the following night, and woke some hours later to a silence so complete, so total, that it took me a moment to understand what had disturbed me. It was not a sound that woke me. It was the absence of one. The silence that screamed. I woke, as I have said, to silence. And silence, in itself, is not a crime. Trains fall quiet in the small hours. Passengers sleep, the wheels settle into their rhythm, and a man might easily mistake the ordinary hush of 4 in the morning for something more sinister. I lay still for a moment, listening to nothing, and told myself I was being foolish. Then I heard, from somewhere down the corridor, a woman's voice, Miss Whitfield's, I thought, rising not in a scream exactly, but in that thin, controlled pitch of a person trying very hard not to scream. I dressed with more haste than dignity, and stepped into the corridor to find the conductor, a stout, capable man named Michel, standing before a closed compartment door with the particular stillness of a man who does not know what to do next. Reverend Whitfield stood beside him, one hand on his niece's shoulder, his notebook, I noticed, nowhere in sight. Monsieur Renaud, Michel said, relieved, it seemed, to have anyone at all to address. There is. I do not know what there is. The gentleman does not answer. The gentleman was Monsieur Dubois. The door was locked from within. This much was evident even before it was forced, for the key sat visibly in the lock on the inside, turned fully, the small brass head catching the corridor light. Michel produced a master key of his own, tried it, and found it would not turn past the resistance of the inner key. There was no other way in. The window, when we came finally to look, was latched from the inside as well, and in any case looked out onto a sheer drop of white nothing, the train by then climbing into the lower reaches of the mountains. It took some minutes and no small effort to force the door, and when at last it gave way, I confess that even I, a man who has over the years seen more of death than any man ought reasonably to see, felt the small, cold shock of it anew. Monsieur Dubois sat in his chair by the window, fully dressed, his coat still upon his shoulders as it had been at dinner, his hands folded in his lap, as though he had settled there to read, and simply never risen again. There was no blood, no wound that any of us could find, then or later. His face bore no expression of terror, no grimace of pain. If anything, it wore the mild, unbothered look of a man who has drifted off mid-thought. Only the stillness of his chest, and the particular grey quality that death alone can lend to skin, told us what we already knew. "A heart attack," said Herr Lang, who had appeared in the doorway behind us. "Pocket watch," I noted, once again in hand. "The cold, the altitude. It happens. It is possible. I will say that much plainly. For a detective who begins with his conclusion already formed is worse than no detective at all. It is possible that Monsieur Dubois died of nothing more sinister than an unkind heart in an unkind season. But I had heard 2 voices through that wall the evening before, and I do not, as a rule, forget such things merely because they become inconvenient. The conductor, to his credit, thought first of the practical difficulty, which was this: somewhere beyond Bregenz, in the night, the tracks ahead had been struck by a fall of snow and rock, not severe enough to be called a disaster, but sufficient to halt us for some hours, while men were sent ahead on foot to assess the damage. We were, in short, sitting motionless in a white and silent valley, unable to go forward, unable to go back, with a dead man in a locked compartment, and no doctor aboard, closer than the next station, itself unreachable until the line was cleared. "No one left this train in the night," Michel said, with the air of a man reciting something he needed very much to believe. "No one could have. The doors are locked from the platforms at this hour, and the emergency cord was not pulled." "Then," I said, more to myself than to him, "whoever did this is still with us." I regret that I said it aloud. Miss Whitfield made a small sound and pressed her gloved hand to her mouth, and the Countess, arriving late and overdressed even at this hour, declared in ringing tones that she had never in her life been treated so shabbily by a railway company, as though the murder, if murder it was, constituted a failure of service comparable to a cold breakfast. I asked that the compartment be left undisturbed, and that the passengers gather, once dressed, in the dining car, where at least there was room to think and coffee to be had. It was here, over the following hour, that I abandoned, with some reluctance, for I had grown fond of Monsieur Reynaud and his simple, unbothered life, the pretence of the wine merchant. "I must tell you," I said, when they were assembled, some 11 passengers in all, plus the conductor and a nervous young steward, that I am not who I have claimed to be. This announcement was received with the mixture of suspicion and relief that such announcements generally receive. The Reverend looked faintly betrayed, as though I had confessed to a lesser sin than the one he'd hoped for. The Countess brightened considerably, sensing drama. Herr Lang said nothing at all, which I noted. "My name is Hercule Poirot," I continued, "and I have, on more occasions than I care to count, been of some assistance in matters such as this one. I would ask, given our present circumstances, that we are quite unable to move and quite unable to summon outside help for some hours yet, that you permit me to ask some questions. Not as an accusation, you understand, only as a man trying to understand a silence that does not wish to be understood." There was a pause, the sort of pause that follows any statement of this kind, in which each person present considers, briefly and privately, what they might have to hide, however small. It was Miss Whitfield who spoke first. "Was he murdered, Monsieur Poirot?" I considered lying to her. It would have been kinder, in the moment. "I did not. I do not yet know," I said, "but I intend to find out, and I will tell you this much, mademoiselle, because I think you would prefer honesty to comfort. A man does not die quietly, with his coat still buttoned and his hands folded so neatly in his lap, unless either God arranged it so, or someone else did." Outside, the snow continued to fall against the windows, soft and indifferent, and somewhere beneath the floor of the carriage, the engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound in a train that had, for the moment, forgotten how to move. The First Interrogations. I have found, over a long career of asking questions that people would rather not answer, that the order in which one interviews a group of suspects matters almost as much as the questions themselves. Begin with the frightened, and you learn only what fear looks like. Begin with the confident, and you learn, sometimes, what confidence is hiding. I began, therefore, with Herr Lang. He seated himself across from me in the dining car. The other passengers had been asked to wait in the adjoining car, within sight but not within hearing, and folded his hands upon the table with the neat, unhurried precision of a man accustomed to negotiations. His pocket watch, I noticed, he had at last put away. "You consult your watch very often, monsieur," I said, by way of beginning. "I am a businessman," he said. "Time is not a luxury to me. It is inventory. And last night, between, let us say, 11 o'clock and 1, I retired at 10:30. I read for perhaps 20 minutes a report on Zurich exchange figures, if it interests you, though I doubt it will, and slept until the disturbance this morning. You heard nothing, no voices, no footsteps. The walls of this train are thin, Monsieur Poirot, but I sleep with cotton in my ears. But a habit from years of hotels with poor soundproofing. I heard nothing at all, which I appreciate you may find convenient, though I assure you it is simply true. It was, I noted, a very tidy alibi. Tidy in the way that a ledger is tidy, every figure accounted for, nothing left to explain. A man who sleeps with cotton in his ears cannot be expected to have heard the voices I myself had heard through Monsieur Dubois' wall. It was almost too convenient an answer, and yet I could not, in that moment, call it a lie. Convenience is not, after all, proof of falsehood. It is only proof that the truth, when it is simple, often looks exactly like a well-rehearsed one. I let him go and called for the Reverend Whitfield. He came in still holding his notebook, which he set upon the table between us, as though offering it for inspection, though I had not asked to see it. "A terrible business," he said, before I had spoken. "I have been praying for the poor man's soul since it happened. I did not know him, you understand. We exchanged perhaps a dozen words in 3 days of travel, but a death is a death, and deserves its prayers regardless of the deceased's character." "You speak as though you had reason to doubt his character." The Reverend's eyes flickered. "A small thing, easily missed, though I did not miss it. I meant nothing by it. Only that we are none of us saints, Monsieur Poirot, myself included. Where were you last night, between 11 and 1? "In my compartment, writing. I sleep poorly on trains, and have found that composing my Sunday sermon helps to settle my mind. My niece can tell you I did not leave. Our compartments share a connecting door, which we leave unlocked, for her comfort as much as mine. She would have heard me had I gone." This, at least, was verifiable, and when I spoke to Miss Whitfield some minutes later, she confirmed it readily. Perhaps too readily, I thought, though a niece defending an uncle is hardly an unusual thing, and I did not wish to read guilt into ordinary affection. Miss Whitfield herself proved a more delicate interview. She sat with her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, in an unconscious echo, I could not help but notice, of the dead man's own posture, and answered my questions in short, careful sentences, as though each word had been measured before it was permitted to leave her mouth. "I heard my uncle's pen," she said, "when I asked about the night. Scratching, you understand, the sound of writing. I heard it for a long while before I slept, and after you slept. I do not know what happens after I am asleep, Monsieur Poirot. That is rather the nature of sleep." It was said lightly, almost playfully, but I noted that her hands, throughout our conversation, did not once unclasp. "Your gloves," I said gently. "You wear them even at breakfast. May I ask why?" Her composure, that bright, determined composure I had noted since the first evening, faltered, very briefly, like a candle in a draught. "A skin condition," she said. "Nothing more interesting than that, I'm afraid. My uncle finds it unsightly, and I find it easier not to discuss." I did not press the matter. There are truths one uncovers by pushing, and truths one uncovers only by waiting, and I did not yet know which sort this was. The Countess, when her turn came, filled the compartment with perfume and complaint in roughly equal measure. She had heard nothing, seen nothing, and wished only to know when the train would move again, as she had an engagement in Paris of the utmost importance, which she described at length without once naming it. Her little dog, uninvited, occupied her lap throughout, and regarded me with far more suspicion than its mistress managed. "You did not know Monsieur Dubois?" I asked. "I did not know him, and I did not wish to. A man who eats alone and speaks to no one is either mourning something or hiding something, and either way, it is not my business to ask which." She said this with the particular satisfaction of a woman who believes she has said something clever, and perhaps, I reflected afterward, she had more clever, certainly, than she knew. By the time I had spoken to the remaining passengers, a young French couple travelling to visit family, an elderly Austrian professor who complained mainly of the cold and seemed only distantly aware that a man had died at all, and the nervous young steward who had brought Monsieur Dubois his dinner the evening before, and could recall nothing remarkable about the encounter, save that the gentleman had tipped generously and said almost nothing. I found myself in possession of a great many facts, and almost no understanding. Each alibi, examined alone, held together perfectly. Herr Lang with his cotton-stuffed ears, the Reverend with his sermon and his unlocked door, Miss Whitfield with her uncle's scratching pen for company, the Countess with her indifference. It was, I thought, remarkably unusual. In my experience, a group of a dozen strangers questioned about a single night rarely produces so tidy a set of accounts. Someone, somewhere, ought to have contradicted someone else, if only by accident. Memory is not so obliging as that. And yet here it was, a perfect, seamless silence, each account slotting into the next like the stones of a well-built wall. It was this very perfection, I confess, that troubled me more than any single lie could have. I stepped out into the corridor for air, such air as one may find on a stationary train buried in snow, and found myself standing once more outside the door of Monsieur Dubois' compartment, now sealed, the body within undisturbed, but for the doctor's brief examination some hours before, which had confirmed only what we already suspected: no wound, no poison detectable by simple means, no obvious violence. A man who had, by every visible sign, simply stopped. And yet I had heard two voices. I stood there some minutes, my hand resting lightly upon the cold brass of the door handle, and permitted myself, for the first time since waking, a small and private admission that I was tired, more tired than the hour alone could account for, and that fatigue, in a man of my profession, is a dangerous companion. It dulls the eye, it softens the memory, and I could not, standing there in the corridor with the snow still falling silently beyond the windows, be entirely certain that the two voices I had heard the night before were not, after all, simply the wireless in the next compartment, or my own imagination, primed as it so often is, to find mystery where there is only mundanity. It was a small doubt, but it was the first crack in my own certainty, and I have learned, over many years, that such cracks are worth remembering, for they return, always, at the moment one least expects them. Fatigue and a small mistake. I have, in the course of a long career, made my share of errors, though I confess I do not often speak of them, for a detective's reputation is a fragile thing, built as much on the appearance of infallibility as on the fact of it. But I set down here, honestly, what occurred that afternoon, because I believe a false modesty is as much a lie as a boast, and I would rather my account be true than flattering. I had not slept properly in 2 nights. This is a small thing, perhaps, to a younger man, but I am not a young man, and my mind, which I have always trusted above all my other faculties, does not perform its best work on borrowed rest. I knew this about myself. I had known it for years. And yet I did what tired men so often do, which is to proceed as though the knowing were sufficient protection against the doing. It was in this state that I returned to question the young steward a second time, having recalled, or believing I recalled, that he had mentioned seeing a second cup upon Monsieur Dubois' dinner tray. "A second cup, monsieur," the boy said, his brow creasing with the particular anxiety of the young when confronted by an authority they do not wish to disappoint. "No, monsieur. I brought one cup, one plate. He dined alone, as always. I was certain, or had been certain, not 5 minutes before, that he had said otherwise." I pressed him on it, perhaps more sharply than the moment warranted, and watched his face grow pale and confused, and it was only afterward, sitting alone with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hands, that I understood my error. I had not misheard him. I had, in my fatigue, conflated his account with a detail from an entirely different conversation. The Countess's steward, questioned an hour earlier, who had mentioned, in passing, a second glass left in the corridor outside her own compartment, unrelated entirely to the matter at hand. It was a small mistake. It changed nothing of substance, but it troubled me more than a larger error might have, for it reminded me, rather unpleasantly, that the machine upon which I had built an entire career was, after all, a human one, subject to the same fraying that afflicts every mind that does not rest when it ought to. I sat with this discomfort for some time before permitting myself to continue, and when I did, I resolved to be more careful, to write things down, as I had not troubled to do in years, trusting instead to a memory I had perhaps too long taken for granted. It was with a small notebook, borrowed rather sheepishly from the Reverend Whitfield, that I resumed my inquiries that afternoon. The young French couple, Monsieur and Madame Auclair, travelling, as they told me, to visit her ailing mother in Lyon, proved unremarkable in the way that happy people so often are unremarkable to a detective's ear. They had retired early, together, and had heard nothing beyond the ordinary sounds of the train. I noted this, and noted also that Madame Auclair's eyes moved, more than once, toward her husband before she answered, as though checking, silently, that her account matched his. It is a common enough habit among married couples, born of long familiarity rather than deceit, and I did not weigh it heavily, though I did not discard it entirely either. A good detective discards nothing entirely. He merely sets some things further back on the shelf than others. The Austrian professor, a Herr Dr. Brandt, proved a more interesting conversation, if only because he seemed entirely unbothered by the death that had brought us all together. "I am 71 years old, Monsieur Poirot," he said, when I asked whether the events of the previous night had disturbed his sleep. "At my age, one has attended a great many deaths, one's own eventual death included, in the imagination if nowhere else. I did not know the man. I am sorry for it. In the abstract way one is sorry for any stranger's misfortune, but I did not lie awake over it, and I will not pretend otherwise for your benefit. You did not find it strange, then, a man dying with a locked door and no wound? I find a great many things strange, monsieur. The century itself is strange. I have stopped remarking on it." He said this with a small, dry smile that suggested he found some private amusement in his own bleakness. "But if you wish my professional opinion, I taught medicine for 30 years. Before my retirement, I would say that a man's heart may stop for reasons that leave no mark at all. Fear, for instance. A sufficient fright in a man with a weak heart is as effective as any blade, and leaves considerably less evidence. This was, I confess, the first genuinely useful thing anyone had told me since the discovery of the body, and I turned it over in my mind for some time after the doctor had gone. A fright, not a wound, not a poison, a fear, sudden and complete enough to stop a failing heart. It did not tell me who, but it told me, perhaps, how, and more importantly, it told me that I was not searching for a weapon at all, but for a moment. A single moment in which Monsieur Dubois had looked upon something, or someone, that his heart could not survive the seeing of. I returned, that evening, to the compartment itself, alone this time. the body having at last been moved to the baggage car under sheets with the doctor's grim permission, until such time as the authorities could be properly summoned. The compartment felt smaller without him in it, and colder, though the temperature had not changed. I examined the room with what care my tired eyes allowed. The window, latched, the door, its lock undamaged by our forcing of it, the mechanism ordinary and unremarkable, a small valise, its contents unremarkable also, shirts, a razor, a novel in French left half read, its spine cracked at roughly the middle. And here, tucked into the novel as a marker, a single scrap of paper, folded twice, upon which someone had written, in a hand I did not recognize, a short phrase in German, Ich weiß, was du getan hast. I know what you did. I sat with this small scrap of paper for a long while, turning it over in the lamplight, and felt, for the first time since boarding this train, something other than fatigue. I felt the particular, quiet thrill that comes to a man of my profession when the shape of a thing, still hidden, still incomplete, begins, at last, to suggest itself in the dark. Someone aboard this train had known something about Monsieur Dubois, had known it, and had told him they knew it, in writing, in a language that was not, as far as I had yet observed, the native tongue of anyone I had questioned that day, save perhaps the Swiss businessman, whose German, I recalled, had carried the particular cadence of the Zurich cantons. I folded the note carefully back into the novel, precisely as I had found it. I did not wish, in my tiredness, to disturb evidence I did not yet fully understand, and made my way back through the darkened corridor to my own compartment, my mind, for the first time that day, entirely awake. Outside, the snow had begun to ease, though the men sent ahead to clear the track had not yet returned, and the train remained exactly where it had stopped, silent and white and waiting, as though it too were holding its breath for what I might discover next. The rivers of lies. I did not sleep well that second night either, though I will say, in fairness to myself, that a scrap of paper reading "I know what you did" is not conducive to easy rest in any man, however seasoned. I lay awake turning the phrase over in my mind, testing it against each face I had questioned that day, and found that it fit, with varying degrees of plausibility, almost all of them, which is to say, it told me a great deal less than I had hoped, and considerably more than I had feared. By morning, the snow had stopped entirely, though word came from Michel that the men clearing the track ahead expected several hours more before the line would be passable. This gave me, I reasoned, one further day, perhaps less, to unravel what I could before the ordinary machinery of the law arrived to take the matter, and the passengers, out of my hands. I resolved, this time, to approach the questioning differently. Where the day before I had asked each passenger to account for their movements, I now asked something more delicate, what they knew of Monsieur Dubois himself. A man who dies alone leaves behind him not a single truth, but a scattering of small ones, held by different people in different amounts, like coins dropped from a torn pocket. My task, I had come to understand, was not to find the one lie that mattered, but to gather the many small ones that did not, until what remained, at the bottom of the sieve, could no longer hide. I began, this time, with Herr Lang, and did not trouble myself with subtlety. "You speak German, Herr Lang. I am Swiss," he said, with the faint impatience of a man asked to confirm something obvious. "German is my first language, yes." "And Monsieur Dubois, did you know him, before this journey?" For the first time in our acquaintance, Herr Lang hesitated. Not long, a fraction of a second only. But I had waited 2 days for precisely such a fraction, and I did not let it pass unremarked. "I met him once," he said, "some years ago, in Geneva. A business matter, nothing of consequence." "You did not mention this yesterday. You did not ask yesterday whether I had known him before this journey. You asked what I heard in the night. I answered truthfully. I am not obliged to volunteer my entire history to a man I met 3 days ago, Monsieur Poirot, whatever name he currently travels under. It was a fair point, sharply made, and I conceded it with a small nod, though I noted the correction all the same, for it is often the passengers most careful to draw the boundary of a question who have the most reason to fear its expansion. The business matter in Geneva, I said. Was it concluded amicably? Business matters are rarely concluded amicably, monsieur. They are concluded, and one moves on. I would not read murder into an old contract dispute if I were you. I let him go, unsatisfied but unwilling, yet to press further without more to press with. It was the Countess who provided, quite unwittingly, the next thread. I found her that afternoon in the dining car, feeding her small dog scraps of bread, with the distracted affection of a woman for whom the animal was clearly a more reliable companion than any of the humans aboard. You said, yesterday, that Monsieur Dubois was either mourning something or hiding something, I said. It was a clever observation. I wonder if you had reason for it, beyond cleverness. She looked pleased to be complimented, and pleasure, I have found, loosens tongues considerably more effectively than pressure does. I saw him once, the first evening, before dinner, in the corridor, reading a letter. He did not know I saw him. He had the look of a man reading his own obituary, Monsieur Poirot. I have seen that look before, on my late husband, before he died, though in his case it was gambling debts, not letters, that put it there. Do you know what the letter said? Of course not. I am nosy, monsieur, not a thief. She said this with such genuine offence that I believed her entirely. But I will tell you this, he burned it. Not then, but later, I think, for I smelled smoke from his compartment that evening, faintly, when I passed. A small thing, probably nothing. It was not nothing. A man who receives a letter that gives him the look of reading his own obituary, and who then burns it rather than keeps it, is a man managing a fear he does not wish to be found holding. And yet the note I had found in his novel, I Know What You Did, had not been burned. It had been kept, deliberately, tucked into a half-read book, like a marker meant to be returned to. 2 documents then, perhaps, one destroyed, one kept. I did not yet know why a man would treat 2 threats, if threats they both were, so differently, unless one had come from a source he feared enough to erase, and the other from a source he wished, for reasons of his own, to remember. I spoke again to Miss Whitfield that afternoon, this time with rather more directness than I had permitted myself before, for I had begun to suspect that her gloves concealed rather more than a skin condition, however real that condition might also be. Mademoiselle, I said gently, I do not wish to embarrass you, but I must ask you to remove your gloves. Her hands went very still in her lap. I told you, Monsieur Poirot. You told me a skin condition, and I do not doubt that this is partly true, but I have observed, over 2 days, that you favour your right hand over your left in small ways, the way you hold your coffee cup, the way you turn the pages of your book. It is the mark of an old injury, not an ongoing illness, and I think you know I am correct. She was silent for a long moment, and when at last she peeled back the glove on her right hand, I saw what I had suspected. A scar, old and pale, running across the base of her fingers, the kind left by a blade rather than an illness. I did this myself, she said, quietly, before I could ask. 3 years ago. It is not a story I wish to tell a stranger on a train, Monsieur Poirot, and I do not believe it has anything to do with Monsieur Dubois, whom I had never met before this journey in my life. I believed the second part of her statement more readily than I believed the reluctance of the first, but I did not press her further. Grief, for I recognized it now, in the particular way she guarded that old wound, is not evidence of murder. It is only evidence of a life that has, at some point, been difficult, and I have learned that difficult lives are the rule among travelers, not the exception. By evening, I had gathered a river of small truths, each flowing in its own direction, none of them yet meeting at a single point. Herr Lang, who had known the dead man and concealed it, the Countess, who had seen a letter burned, Miss Whitfield, who carried an old grief in a scar she preferred hidden, The Reverend, whose notebook I had still not been permitted to examine closely, and whose flicker of doubt about the dead man's character I had not forgotten. Even the young steward, questioned a third time, now recalled, hesitantly, as though ashamed of his earlier certainty, that he might have heard raised voices from somewhere down the corridor sometime after midnight, though he could not say from which compartment, nor swear to it under oath. None of it, alone, pointed to murder. All of it, together, pointed to a train full of people who had each, in their own small way, decided that the truth was safer kept than told. I sat that night in the dining car long after the other passengers had retired, a single lamp burning, the notebook I had borrowed from the Reverend now filled with my own cramped observations, and admitted to myself, with the particular honesty a man permits himself only when alone, that I did not yet know who had killed Monsieur Dubois, if indeed he had been killed at all, and not simply frightened by his own conscience into an unkind and private death. But I knew, with increasing certainty, that the answer did not lie in what anyone had told me. It lay, somewhere, in what they had not. Those who stayed silent. There is a particular kind of thinking that cannot be done while pacing, nor while questioning, nor even while writing in a borrowed notebook by lamplight. It can only be done while sitting very still, with one's eyes closed, and allowing the mind to walk back over everything it has gathered, not in search of what was said, but in search of the shape left behind by what was not. I sat in this manner for the better part of an hour that night, and it was only when Michel came to inform me that the track ahead had, at last, been cleared, that we would be moving again within the day, and that the authorities at the next station had been telegraphed and would be waiting to take charge of both the body and, presumably, of me and my amateur investigations, that I opened my eyes and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only after a long and patient silence of one's own, what I had been failing to see. I had been listening, these 2 days, for lies. I had caught several, small ones, mostly, the kind that litter any group of strangers thrown together by circumstance, each one guarding some private embarrassment that had nothing whatever to do with murder, Herr Lang's old business dealings, the Countess's idle gossip, Miss Whitfield's scarred hand. I had gathered these small deceptions as a man gathers stones on a beach, each one interesting, none of them, alone, sufficient to build anything. But a lie, I reminded myself, is not the only way a person hides the truth. Sometimes the truth is hidden simply by not being offered at all, by a silence so ordinary, so unremarkable, that it does not even register as an omission until one steps back far enough to see its shape. I took up my notebook again and did something I had not thought, until that moment, to do. I did not write down what each passenger had said. I wrote down, instead, what each passenger had not been asked, and more precisely, what each had contrived, gently and almost invisibly, never to volunteer. Herr Lang had told me, unprompted, of cotton in his ears, of a report on Zurich exchange figures, of a business matter in Geneva he preferred not to discuss. He had, in 2 days of questioning, never once asked me a single question about the investigation itself, not how Monsieur Dubois had died, not what I suspected, not when we might expect the authorities. A man untouched by guilt is, in my experience, at least as curious as he is defensive. Herr Lang had shown me only the defense. The Reverend Whitfield had spoken to me at length of prayer, of sermons, of the general sinfulness of mankind, and yet in 2 full conversations had never once mentioned what, precisely, he and Monsieur Dubois had exchanged in those dozen words over 3 days of travel. A dozen words is a curiously specific number for a man to recall about a conversation he claims held no significance. Miss Whitfield had told me, eventually, of her scar, but she had done so only when directly compelled, and even then had steered the conversation immediately back toward grief in the abstract, away from the particular. She had never told me, though I had in fact never quite asked, where precisely she had been travelling from, nor why an unmarried young woman travelled with her uncle rather than her parents. The Countess had spoken freely of everything except the one detail that might have mattered most, what the burned letter had looked like. She had told me she smelled smoke. She had not told me, and I realized now, with some irritation at my own earlier carelessness, that I had not thought to ask from which direction the smoke had come, nor at what hour precisely. And the young steward, questioned 3 times, had grown steadily less certain of his own memory with each telling, which is, in itself, an unusual pattern. Ordinarily, a witness's memory sharpens under repeated questioning, as small details are jogged loose by careful prompting. His had done the opposite. He had remembered more on the second occasion than the first, and less on the third than the second, as though something, or someone, had, between my visits, encouraged him to remember rather less than he originally had. I sat with this observation for a long while, turning it over. A witness's memory does not grow dimmer on its own. It grows dimmer because someone has spoken to him. I found the boy. His name, I had by now learned, was Jacques, polishing glasses in the empty dining car, and I asked him plainly, without preamble, whether anyone aboard the train had spoken to him since our last conversation about what he had heard the night of the murder. He flushed, immediately, in the particular way of the young and the honest when caught in even a small deception. "The Reverend," he admitted, after a moment. He said it was unkind, monsieur, to speculate about raised voices when I could not be certain. He said false testimony was a sin against a man's memory, and that I ought to be careful not to invent things simply to please a detective. It was, on its face, an entirely reasonable thing for a clergyman to say to an anxious young steward. And yet I could not help but notice that of everyone aboard this train, it was the Reverend Whitfield, the man of God, the man least suspected, the man whose alibi rested most entirely on the unlocked door between his compartment and his niece's, who had taken it upon himself to quiet the one witness who might, however uncertainly, have placed voices in the corridor at the hour of the murder. I thanked the boy, told him he had done nothing wrong in telling me this, and returned to my compartment with a great deal more to think about than I had possessed an hour before. It was not proof. I want to be entirely honest in this account and say plainly that at this point I had no single fact that would satisfy a court, or even a particularly skeptical policeman. I had a pattern of silences: the businessman who never asked questions, the clergyman who managed a witness's memory, the niece who deflected toward abstraction, the countess who withheld the one useful detail from an otherwise generous account. 4 silences, each small, each individually explicable, by nothing more sinister than ordinary human privacy. But I have long believed, and this journey did nothing to disabuse me of the belief, that the truth, when it hides, does not hide behind one great wall. It hides behind many small doors, each pulled shut by a different hand, for a different reason, and the detective's task is not to find the single door with the body behind it, but to notice that all the doors, taken together, form the walls of a single room. I lay awake that final night, for I sensed, correctly as it turned out, that it would be my final night aboard the Silent Carriage, as I had privately begun to call her, and allowed myself, for the first time, to construct a theory. I will not set it down here in full, for I had not yet tested it, and a theory untested is worth no more than a guess dressed in confidence. But I will say this much: it began, as all my theories eventually do, not with who had the strongest motive, nor who had the weakest alibi, but with the question that had haunted me since the Austrian doctor first raised it 2 days before. What had Monsieur Dubois seen in that locked compartment that his heart could not survive the seeing of? And why, I now added to the question, had 4 separate people, a businessman, a clergyman, a young woman, and a countess, each independently decided, in their own small way, that I was better off not finding out? I did not sleep that night so much as I rested with my eyes closed, my mind continuing its work regardless, the way a machine left running continues to turn even after the operator has stepped away. And when the first grey light of morning came through the curtain, and the train, at last, gave the small shudder that meant the engine had begun, once more, to move, I rose, dressed, and made my way to the dining car with the particular calm of a man who believes, at last, that he is close to an answer and who is not yet certain whether he will like what it turns out to be. The last silence. I asked Michel to gather the passengers once more in the dining car, and I confess I did so with none of the theatrical flourish for which, I am told, I am sometimes known. I was tired. My feet, which had ached since the very first hour of this journey, had not stopped aching since, and I felt, more than usual, the full weight of my 60-odd years as I took my place at the head of the car and waited for the last of them to settle into their seats. The train was moving again, slowly, carefully, over track still uncertain beneath its recent burial of snow, and I found something almost mournful in the small vibration of it beneath my feet, as though the Orient Express herself were reluctant to carry us onward before the matter among us had been properly closed. "I will not keep you long," I began, "for I know we are none of us eager to prolong this journey any further than necessary. But I believe I understand, now, what happened to Monsieur Dubois, and I think it only right that you hear it from me before the authorities take the matter from my hands entirely." I let my eyes move slowly across the room. Herr Lang, composed as ever. The Reverend, his notebook once more in his lap, his hand resting upon it as though for comfort. Miss Whitfield beside him, very pale, her gloved hands still. The Countess, her dog silent in her arms for once, sensing perhaps that the moment called for it. "Monsieur Dubois," I said, "did not die by any weapon. There was no wound because there was no blade, no poison, no hand laid upon him at all in the final moment of his life. He died, I believe, of his own heart, a heart already weakened, as our good Dr. Brandt suggested to me some days ago, by fear alone. A sufficient fright, in a man so afflicted, requires no dagger. It requires only a truth, spoken aloud, at the right moment, by the right person." "Then it was no murder at all," said Herr Lang, not without a note of relief. "That," I said, "is a question I will leave to lawyers cleverer than myself. But I do not think the person who spoke that truth intended it as murder. I think they intended only to be heard, after perhaps years of not being heard at all." I turned, then, to the note I had found tucked within the dead man's novel, and set it upon the table before me. "I know what you did." 6 words, in German, kept, not burned, as another letter in his possession had been, some days before, a letter the Countess was kind enough to mention smelled of smoke upon the evening air. 2 documents, gentlemen, mesdames. 1 destroyed, 1 kept. A man destroys what he fears others might find. He keeps what he cannot bear to let go of, even, I think, when it condemns him. I let this sit a moment before continuing. Monsieur Dubois was not, I believe, entirely the man his ticket claimed him to be. I telegraphed, before we resumed moving, to a contact of mine in Geneva, and received, in return, a rather illuminating reply. I did not say that this contact was Michel, relaying a message through the wireless operator at considerable inconvenience, nor that the reply had taken the better part of the morning to arrive. The theatre of certainty, I have found, is sometimes as necessary to the truth as the truth itself. Some 11 years ago, a factory under different ownership, a factory in which a young girl's father was employed, suffered a structural failure that took the lives of 6 men. An inquiry followed. It found, officially, that the disaster was an act of unavoidable circumstance. Unofficially, I am told, certain inspection reports were altered, certain safety warnings quietly buried, by a man eager to avoid the cost of proper repair. That man did not go by the name Dubois at the time. He went by another name entirely, which he abandoned, along with a great many other things, not long after. The room had gone very still. Herr Lang, I continued, was retained, some years later, by the company that had since acquired the factory, to quietly investigate irregularities in its historical accounts, irregularities that led, eventually, to the very name Dubois was trying, so carefully, to leave behind. This is why you knew him in Geneva, monsieur, and why you were so careful not to say so unless directly asked. You had no part in his death. But you recognized him the moment you boarded this train, did you not? And you said nothing, because you did not wish to be the man who pointed a finger at a corpse. Herr Lang did not deny it. He only closed his eyes briefly and nodded once. The Reverend Whitfield, I said, turning now, gently, to the older man, is not, I think, entirely a stranger to this history either, though I believe his part in it is one of kindness rather than guilt. Reverend, you did not simply happen upon your niece. You took her in, some years ago, did you not? A girl left with nothing after her father's death. A girl who blamed herself, wrongly, foolishly, as the young so often do, for not having warned him, though she could not possibly have known what she did not yet understand. Miss Whitfield had begun, very quietly, to cry. Not the sharp, startled tears of shock, but the slow, exhausted tears of a grief long carried and finally, unavoidably, set down. It was not my place to speak of her past, the Reverend said, his voice unsteady for the first time since I had known him. She has built a life since then, Monsieur Poirot, a fragile one, but a real one, and I could not stand by and let a stranger's questions unpick it, whatever the cost to my own honesty. I told the boy Jacques to be careful with his memory, not because I feared what he had heard, but because I feared what conclusions a frightened young man might leap to, once he understood what he had heard. I do not think you deliberately concealed a murder, Reverend, I said. I think you concealed a wound, one that was not yours to expose. I turned, at last, to Miss Whitfield herself, and I confess, this was the part of the conversation I had least wished to conduct, for I do not enjoy being the instrument by which private grief becomes public fact. You recognized him, I said gently. Not at once, I think. Not on the first evening. But at some point during this journey, something in his face, or his voice, or perhaps simply his name, spoken by the conductor, told you who he had once been. She nodded, very small, into her gloved hands. I went to him that night, she said, so quietly, I had to lean forward to catch it over the low sound of the wheels beneath us. I did not plan it. I could not sleep. I told you that much, and it was true, though I did not tell you why. I saw him, through his half-open door, reading, and something in me simply went to him. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten him. I only told him that I knew what he had done, and what it had cost my family, and that I had carried the mark of it. Here she lifted, briefly, her scarred hand. For 3 years, while he had carried nothing at all but a new name and a train ticket to somewhere else. And then I left. He said nothing to me. Nothing at all, Monsieur Poirot, which frightened me more than anger would have. He simply sat there, very still, and I thought, foolishly, that I had said what I needed to say, and that would be the end of it. I went back to my compartment. I did not know. Her voice broke here, entirely. I did not know a heart could simply stop from being told the truth. I thought I was only speaking. I did not think I was killing him. I let the silence sit for a long moment before I spoke again, for I did not think it right to rush past what had just been said. I believe you, I said, finally. I do not think you intended his death, mademoiselle, and I do not think, in the eyes of any fair court, that a truth spoken quietly, in a locked room, by a grieving young woman, constitutes murder. He locked that door himself, after you left. Of that I am certain, for the key showed no sign of having been turned by any hand but his own from within. I think he sat with what you had told him, alone, in the manner of a man finally facing something he had spent 11 years running from, and I think his heart, weakened as it was, simply could not survive the arrival of what he had so long outrun. The dining car remained silent for a long while after that. Not the tense, watchful silence of the past 2 days, but something quieter, sadder, and, I thought, more honest than anything that had passed between these passengers since the journey began. It was the Countess, of all people, who broke it, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief entirely disproportionate to her earlier complaints about drafts and service. "Well," she said, with a slightly damp attempt at her usual briskness, "I suppose I shall have to tell my friends in Paris that I once shared a dining car with a genuine tragedy, and not merely a delayed train." I did not laugh, though I understood the impulse behind it, the particular human need, after grief, to reach for something ordinary to hold on to. I spoke privately, afterward, with the authorities who met us at the next station, a small matter of professional courtesy, one detective to another, and told them, as honestly as I could, what I believed had occurred. A death by natural, if precipitated causes, a confrontation born of old grief rather than malice. A young woman who had, in her own words, only meant to be heard after years of silence. What became of that account in the official record, I confess I did not follow closely enough to say with certainty, though I will admit, and this too I set down honestly, for a man's account of himself ought not flatter him more than the truth allows, that I did not labour especially hard to see Mademoiselle Whitfield formally charged with anything at all. There are silences, I have come to believe, that protect cruelty, and there are silences that protect only pain. And a lifetime of this work has taught me, imperfectly and slowly, to tell the difference. I left the train some hours later at Calais, my feet still aching, my borrowed name discarded along with the wine merchant's coat I had worn for 3 days, and found myself, as I so often do at the end of such matters, thinking not of the solution, which had, in the end, been simpler and sadder than any of us had first supposed, but of the silences themselves. The businessman who withheld a truth to avoid seeming an accuser, the clergyman who withheld a truth to protect a wound not his own, the countess who withheld a truth out of nothing more than a stranger's discretion, and the girl who, after years of enforced and grieving silence, had finally broken it, and had broken, with it, a man's weakened heart. It is a strange thing, I thought, boarding the ferry that would carry me back across a grey and ordinary sea, that a train can travel so far, through so many mountains, and arrive, in the end, not at a destination at all, but simply at the truth, quietly, the way all the most important truths seem to arrive, not with a scream, but with a silence finally allowed to speak.